Okay, the hour has come. Welcome, everyone. This is the December edition of the Philadelphia Committee on City Policy Luncheon Series. Since the pandemic, we have gone virtual, and will continue to do so until further notice. It has allowed us to actually have some innovations on the way that we conduct our panels luncheon series. Today, we're really, really pleased to have with us a person who has been a fixture in Philadelphia public life and has served in many hats the people of Philadelphia and the region. Please join me in welcoming Phil Goldsmith, who's most recently is the author of a Philadelphia Education, Tales, Trials, and Tribulations of a Serial Careerist, someone who's been in public service most of his adult life. Phil has held senior positions in some of Philadelphia's leading institutions, both in the private and public sector and also in the non-profit sector. He has served as a deputy mayor, chief operating officer of the city of Philadelphia, interim director of the Fairmount Park Commission, and chief executive officer of the School District of Philadelphia. He also is an attorney by training, and he worked as a lawyer and as a journalist for the Allentown Morning Call. Uh, he also joined the Philadelphia Inquirer as a reporter and later served on the editorial board, where he was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for a series of editorials he wrote on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. That series was entitled Supreme Disgrace. He later became a banker and was a senior executive at PNC Bank in Philadelphia and also in Pittsburgh for about 12 years. He also has senior positions in the executive search and career management sectors. In his retirement, he has been active in civic affairs, most importantly and notably with Ceasefire PA, the state leading gun violence prevention organization, where he served as president for several years. For the past 3 years, Phil has served as president of the Haverford Township Free Libraries Board of Directors. Uh, Phil's book is a compilation of experiences while he served in high level roles in government, the media, law, and banking. His insights into the life of Philadelphia, its politics, the hiring laws of his different careers, from fighting snowstorm, very appropriately this week, to working for a mayor who was under federal investigation, to trying to cope with that school system that was near bankruptcy, educationally challenged, and involved in a bitter fight with the state over privatization. The stories contained in his books are insightful, humorous, and sometimes tragic. Phil, welcome to Philadelphia Committee on City Policy. The floor is
Thank you,
yours.
Pedro, and hello to all the people out there, many whose names I know and are friends of mine. Um, so I'm supposed to talk on equity, and when I first saw that, having actually my longest occupation has been as a banker, I didn't know if you meant stock equity, but my guess is you mean equity in terms of fairness and race and so forth. And I'll try to relate some of the things that I think were significant in my career, particularly when I was with the city and the school district, as it relates to equity. Um, and then, want to certainly take questions. I guess you'll use chat or however you do that. Um, Let me tell you the origin for this book, the reason for this book. And as you can tell by my resume, I think the title saying career serialist is very apt. Some maybe say career ADD. I don't know, whatever people want to say. But we were sitting around the dinner table one night down at we have a summer place down at the shore, and one of my youngest grandson, Eli, started to go around the table and he asked his father how he liked being the director of Camp Tecumseh, and he asked his mother how she liked teaching history, and he asked my wife, how do you like working at Children's Hospital? Went all around the table, how everyone liked their jobs. And then he turned to me and he said, Pa, how do you like being at home? And I realized then that he had no idea, and probably my grandchildren had no idea of what I've done with my life. And so I decided to tell this, tell this book. And, I think it's somewhat of a history of Philadelphia seen through my eyes, and certainly some stories that I have. And as Pedro said, some of them are humorous and some of them are tragic, like when I was at the school district and a lunch table fell on the head of a 5-year-old boy and he died. But what I want to do is I'm going to read certain portions of my book just to give you a sense, and then I'll get into some of these topics. But I want to start from when I came to Philadelphia. And let me just turn to this. This is chapter 3, what Philadelphia had that no other city had. When I arrived in Philadelphia in February 1972, it was like other large American cities at the time. Racially polarized with high crime rates, it was infected with drugs and gangs, experiencing white flight in full gallop, and dealing with municipal unions flexing their muscles. Public pensions were growing exponentially. The city's finances were as stable as a punch-drunk boxer, and the school district was a mess, financially, politically, and educationally. The city's population, once 2 million people strong, was virtually in free fall, and the complexion of the city was quickly changing as well. While other cities were experiencing what Philadelphia was going through, Philadelphia had something that no other city had. Frank Lazaro Rizzo, who had become the city's 93rd mayor a month before my arrival. A former law and order police commissioner, Rizzo was a huge man, 6'2", over 250 pounds, with a chest as broad as a gigantic sequoia tree, an 11E school size befitting the Loch Ness Monster. The only thing larger than his physical stature was his booming voice. Rizzo was authoritarian and divisive and had little regard for the truth. When he was challenged to take a lie detector test, he agreed to take it. If a machine says you lied, he said, then you lied. He flunked the test and Rizzo quickly changed his tune. Quote, it was not worth the paper it's written on. I actually footnote that, and I say the footnote is, Philadelphia often prides itself as a city of firsts: public library, fire insurance company, hospital, botanical garden, computer, and you can add to the list the first Donald Trump, personified as Frank Rizzo. So Rizzo was the mayor. He had been police commissioner, as we all know. And if you want to start to talk about, equity and race and polarization, you got to almost begin with Rizzo, and that's where I started seeing what this was about.
So
And
Phil,
actually,
if I yeah, that's
sure.
interesting. In terms of the public sector, the question of equity and inclusion in the city workforce uh, is, I think that maybe the sole issue, the inequities that exist, is that the city workforce does not reflect the population of the city today. Do you think that was preceded Frank Rizzo, or it was deepening or more institutionalized during his time as mayor?
Well, let me say, let me put it, the governance of the city certainly did not reflect the workforce. Now, at that time, in 1970, the city's population was 64% white. It is now 34% white, I think. So it's changed. But city council at that time only had, of the 17 members, only 4 were African American: Charles Durham, Ethel Allen, who was a Republican, Edgar Campbell, and Joe Coleman. Today there's 4 Caucasians on city council. So obviously the city population has changed, the governance structure has changed, and so and the workforce. But I think one of the issues with equity, and we can get into this a little bit, is the civil service system, and whether, in retrospect, while that was put in place to make the city, quote, more honest, one could argue that perhaps there are impediments in the civil service system that don't allow it to reflect the the composition of the city. So that's something we can debate. But that's what I came into, and then I was working at the Inquirer. In the first trial that I covered was the Von Collin trial, and some of you may remember Officer Von Collin. He was stationed in Cobbs Creek Parkway, and he was gunned down. And Rizzo, who was then police commissioner, that the shooting actually happened in '67. The trial didn't start till '72. Launched the largest manhunt in the city's history, and they rounded up a bunch of folks from the Black Panthers, and he basically had them strip searched, and a picture of them, it's a conflict whether they were just in their underwear or whether they were actually naked, went worldwide. I mean, you can't say it would have gone more virtual in today's society than it did back then when we didn't have the internet. But that's what we saw, in Rizzo. And then, from Rizzo, I joined the Philadelphia Bar Association, and you can say back then, the governance structure of the Bar Association, it did not reflect the composition of lawyers in Philadelphia. They had what was known as the Board of Governors. There was only one Black on the Board of Governors. Now, I must say, I don't know what it is now, but they've subsequently had African Americans who have been chancellor of the Bar Association and so forth. I then went to join the Bill Green campaign in 1979. I left the Inquirer editorial board. I didn't know whether Green was going to, win or not, but I decided I was young enough that if he lost, I could pick myself up and so forth. And this was an eye opener to me, being in a campaign. I thought, as an editorial board writer, when you're an editorial board writer, you come to the office, at least at that time, and you would read the Philadelphia Inquirer, the New York Times, the Philadelphia Daily News, and the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin, which obviously doesn't exist anymore. And then we'd get together, 6 of us or 7 of us, and decide who we were going to criticize in our editorials. And then we spent the rest of the day writing our editorials. And I thought so when I joined the Green campaign, I thought I knew something about Philadelphia because I was, I pontificated every day when I was at the Inquirer, and I realized I knew very little about Philadelphia. I may have known the white parts of the city somewhat, but I certainly didn't know that there was another whole portion of Philadelphia. Didn't understand I thought the press was basically the Inquirer, the Daily News. I didn't realize that there was really a Philadelphia Tribune, that there were Black radio stations, and Green won, but the election, ironically, turned out. We talk about what was it, a month now that until Biden was Trump accepted. Well, he hasn't accepted, but the Electoral College, I guess it's about a month. It was 2 months after Green ran against Charlie Bowser. Charlie was an African American, well regarded African American. And the night of the election, and we sort of sensed that, Green was going to win. It was going to be a pretty easy win. And there was a foul up with the election machines. And we had two voting machines at the time, the Shoup machine and the Jamestown machine. And the way the numbers were taken off, there was some confusion. And the Bowser camp basically saying that, hanky-panky was going on. They wouldn't accept the results. We eventually had to go back and all the votes had to be recounted. And then it went before a judge. And it wasn't until 2 months later that Judge Harvey Schmidt, an African-American judge, basically said, no, the election was on the up and up, and Green won, by about 40,000 votes. But during that time, between that and the certification, Charlie Bowser and other blacks, there was a fellow by the name of Sam Evans, who some of you will remember, really started to, talk about the election being stolen, it wasn't right, and so forth. And Green, to sort of get out of this thing and to make sure that the blacks would be on his side during the general election, struck a deal with Sam Evans, and Dolores Tucker was involved, and agreed that he would appoint an African American as managing director, thus W. Wilson Goode. So one could argue, in retrospect, that if the voting machines hadn't, if the votes hadn't been improperly coming off the voting machines, that we wouldn't have had that kerfuffle, and that Green would not have felt the need to make that commitment of appointing an African American, and Wilson Goode may have never become managing director or mayor. Just a supposition. And then Green takes office, and I think it was 3 weeks into office, Abscam happened. Now, I presume most of you on, listening in or watching in remember Abscam. A lot of people forget it, don't even remember it. They remember it as a movie now. But as a result of that, you had George X. Schwartz, who was city council president, Harry Gennady, who was head of the finance committee, and Louis Johansson, all city councilmen, caught on film, on tape, taking money from what everyone thought was an Arab sheik. He wasn't. It was a sting by the FBI. We had a couple congressmen, Ray Lederer, a couple from New Jersey, Angeletti, the fellow, the mayor of Camden, Eric Ketty, they went to jail. So all of a sudden, Green takes over, thinking that he would have this relationship with George Schwartz, who was a strong city council president, who was really appointed, became a city councilman because of Bill Green's father, replacing a guy by the name of Sam Rose. And all of a sudden, Schwartz is caught up in this, unbelievable controversy of taking money. The story hit the newspaper before there were any indictments and so forth. And there was a new councilman that was just elected during the Green election by the guy by the name of John F. Street, who was, most people thought he was from North Philly. He was actually from the King of Prussia, Conshohocken area. He grew up on a farm and so forth. But Street had his big afro, and every day he would get in George Schwartz's face in city council and say, George, when are you going to resign? When are you going to resign? Point his finger in George Schwartz's face. It was just unbelievable. And eventually Schwartz resigned. Street made a name of himself, worked hard, understood the city budget, better than anyone, perhaps with the exception of the finance director, ultimately becomes city council president, and ultimately mayor. So one could also surmise if Abscam never happened and George Schwartz had stayed on and so forth, maybe John Street stays a backbencher and never becomes, mayor of Philadelphia. So these are things that, we don't know. But in time, the city has obviously changed and issues of equity. Now, when Green became mayor, I believe Bill Green should be noted. He was a transition from what I'm going to call a white Philadelphia to a black Philadelphia. And I don't mean it that polarized. But he started to, you had Wilson Good in the administration, high position. You had the revenue commissioner being a guy by the name of Gene Cleat. He also did the unthinkable. The police department and the fire department had always been off bounds. They were the departments no one touched, and particularly when Rizzo was mayor. And we came in and Rizzo had left us with a humongous problem financially. The city was a mess financially. Union contracts were given out, when elections got closer, Rizzo, or when he was trying to add a third term, gave out the rich contracts and so forth. And so Green had to do what, he had to do. He had to lay off people. And included in that layoff were police and firemen. That had never happened before. And in a sense, that was a form of equity. So you can't separate out these departments who were predominantly white. They had to be in the pot with everyone else. And so, and we start to see this, this equity in a little bit more of a balanced form as Green took over. Now, and then the next thing that happened, there had been, and this is so relevant to today, there was no deadly force policy. In this police department didn't have a deadly force policy. The police department did and was protected by Frank Rizzo. Okay. There was never a bad cop. Rizzo said, oh, the cops are good and all that stuff. And there was no deadly force policy. And so Green comes up with a deadly force policy is when police can use deadly force. We didn't have one. And probably about 3 weeks later, a policeman gets killed. And I'd have to look at my book to remember his name. There's actually a mural of him in Manayunk. And I think it was, I want to say from the 24th district, get ambushed by some guy. His wife worked in the same district. His brother worked in the same district. And it was a tragedy. And the guy gets shot, he dies. And all of a sudden, there's a big fight and a finger pointing by the Rizzocrats, the Al Perlmans of the world, and Franny Rafferty of the world, and so forth, that this guy lost his life because of Bill Green's deadly force policy. And the FOP gets involved, and it was a big thing. And they subpoenaed Green to appear before city council, of which Green did. And I helped prepare him, as I helped him prepare him for all his debates as mayor. We helped prepare him for going before city council. And we had all these charts made up as to how many police were killed when Rizzo was mayor, how many had been killed, when the streets Green's first year as mayor, and so forth and so on, what the deadly force policy was. And Green gets up there, and Green had been a congressman for 13 years. He could be a very good speaker. And he doesn't sit at the desk. He just gets up there with a microphone. He starts going around. I don't know how many of you are on that remember this. Goes around and using the charts and just rips city council to shreds. And basically he said, city council doesn't run the police department. That's a responsibility of the mayor through the managing director, through the police commissioner. and we're not backing off this policy, had nothing to do, and just lays it out. And as I say in the book, I was never more proud to be associated with the Green administration than I was then. Uh, and the policeman's brother, uh, who had also been a cop, he gets up and he testifies and, blames the street for the loss of his brother and so forth and so on. About 2 months later, he writes a handwritten note to Bill Green and says that, I'm sorry, you did the right thing. I was wrong. I was emotional and I was being used by other forces. And I wanted to include the book and the letter in the book, but Green didn't give me permission. So we saw this fight over, the deadly force, and we set up a police accountability thing. So these are some of the things I remember from, starting to get some equity into Philadelphia and certainly the police department. Now, I sometimes wonder where that equity is gone, and I sometimes wonder who's running our police department. That is not a shot at Commissioner Outlaw. It's a shot at Jim Kenney, because the mayor of the city runs the police department, is ultimately responsible for the police department. And I think we have a mayor that's MIA a little bit. We can get into that later. So the Green years were interesting in terms of seeing this struggle for trying to get more equity, in government, more justice, appointing more people of color to city government. Green, had his own tussles with it. In fact, I think I write here when he selected Wilson Good, and I know Mary Hurdick is on this call. I think so. So she'll appreciate this. When Street, find this here. When Green selects Wilson Good, he says, "I'm selecting the best person, blah 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 blah, who happens to be black." So he didn't start out saying I'm selecting an African American. He just happened to be black, and that was Bill Green's, I think, tussle between his background growing up, in sort of the Kensington area of Philadelphia, and wrestling with his own issues over race and how far do you go and so forth. There was also at the time a big issue over the police department and the composition of the police department. It gets a little bit back to your question, Pedro, on the composition. And Green was getting pressured to actually put in a lottery. We would select a policeman by lottery, as I recall, and there was a boycott of the Martin Luther King breakfast. It was pretty ugly. Eventually, that got worked out by the settlement of a federal lawsuit. The other thing, and I'll get off the Green years here. The other thing, many of you might remember Whitman Park. Under the Rizzo administration, Whitman Park was a public housing that was going in South Philadelphia, Whitman Park area. And Rizzo said, "No way, it ain't going up under my watch." And the city gets sued. And the federal government says the city is not getting any federal funds, what was at that time known as UDAG grants. They were development grants because the city refuses to build public housing because they don't want blacks living in that area. And eventually, Judge Broderick of the federal court, who was a former Republican candidate for governor, says it's got to be built. And Green said, absolutely, we're going to build it. He actually went down there to Whitman Park and faced an ugly crowd, but that got built. And as a result, money started to flow back into Philadelphia that had been denied because of the racist policies under the Rizzo administration. So I should remember, before I forget, let me just mention one thing about Rizzo. because Rizzo's name has come up because of the statue. And I have to remind people that that statue went up in 1998. And at the ceremony of that statue going up was a man by the name of Ed Rendell, who was mayor of Philadelphia, who had been DA, understood Rizzo's record. And Rendell was there, sort of presided. I don't know if he presided over the ceremony, but gave a very flattering speech about Frank Rizzo. And also there was John Street, who was then candidate for mayor. Would they be there today if the same circumstance? I doubt it. Go ahead, Pedro. You were going to ask me something.
Just two things, and then we're going to go open the floor for questions. And then those in attendance, will you please type your questions in the chat section, and then I will read it to Phil. How will you assess the Wilson good years in terms of promoting equity within city government and the city in general? And then the second part, I mean, I think everybody wants to know what it was like to be in government during the federal investigation of John Street.
Yeah. You know, I'm going to bug off the good comment for a reason. I mean, I'll tell you what I thought of him as managing director, but I really, by this time I went in banking. When I actually helped Good in his campaign, help him prepare for his debates. Neil Oxman, who a lot of you may know, who's a very famous political, I don't want to say operator, but the campaign guru. He and I and a guy by the name of Miles Martell, who I knew from my, I won't bore you with how I knew Miles Martell. Martell was a Republican, and he was Ronald Reagan's debate coach. And so Good hired Martell, and Wilson was involved in the campaign. And I was at the bank at the time, asked to participate because I knew I helped Bill Green with his debates. And so I got, and I knew Wilson as, managing director, and I had a lot of, relationships with him and so forth. But by this time I was, sort of, I wasn't involved in the city as much then. And so I can't speak to the details of Wilson as a mayor as I could obviously with a Bill Green or John Street, because my focus, my career was going another way. But I would think from an equity point of view, if you're talking about hiring people of color, I'm sure he did a lot, more of it. As a fiscal steward, I think we had huge problems. And one of the thorns in his side was John Street as a city councilman. And it was during his time that PICA came into existence, because the city, I think it was his time, was really in a mess. And obviously we have the unfortunate thing on move. But I can't talk about the equity issue, but I would think that just like John Street's priorities were different than Ed Rendell's priorities, I think Wilson's priorities were somewhat different than Bill Green's. I should also say, during the Green years is when Connie Clayton was hired, and for the first time, a school district that was now becoming overly African American now had a black superintendent, for the first time.
And then the whole issue of the federal investigation. Well,
yeah. So if you read my book, I have a much different view of John Street than I gotta say a lot of people do. I knew Street when I worked for the Green administration. He had just become a city councilman. I didn't know him well. I had my, remember, just questioning. You didn't want to go before city council when John Street was there, because he would blister you to death with questions and so forth. And when I and he was the one to eventually appoint me as head of the school district. It was him and Tom Ridge. They had an agreement that they would appoint an interim CEO and they would agree on it. I happen to know Tom Ridge's best friend from my working at PNC Bank. And so Ridge knew me by reputation, and I was acceptable to Ridge. And ultimately, I was recommended to Street by people like Debbie Kahn, who I knew very well, and George Burrell, who worked in the Green administration and so forth. So it was during working at the school district that I really got to know John Street more. I was at my apartment at a place at Rittenhouse Square. The phone rings and it's City Hall. And they tell me a fireman's down and he's at the hospital. So and that would be normally the case. Managing director would get a phone call when something like that happens. I called up the mayor. I said, Mayor, there's a fireman down. He's at, I forget the hospital, somewhere in the Northeast. He said, well, come on over to, meet me at the corner of the northeast corner of City Hall and we'll go up together. So I go over there. And as we're getting in his van, George Burrell comes out of the City Hall and he says to the mayor, they found something in your office. And Street and I get in the car. So I was with Street, probably the only person with him, except for the driver. At the time, he learned that his office was being bugged. And we go up to the hospital, and we didn't talk much. He was very, rather pensive. And on the way back, and Street and I were basically the same age. He's a year or two older than I am, but we grew up in politics at the same time. So, he could mention something from yesteryear and I would know what he was talking about and vice versa. And so he starts talking about AppScan. And he says, I learned a lot from AppScan. He said, I would never do something like that and so forth. And so I didn't know, frankly, whether he was talking about he wouldn't be so stupid to be caught like that, or he wouldn't do something like that. And I didn't know him that well. But I found John Street to be a terrific guy to work for. I think he was miscast in the white press, which i.e. the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Daily News. I thought the white press was far too easy on Ed Rendell. Ed Rendell was like a frat boy, and the writers, the Inquirer writers, he was like a fraternity brother. And John Street wasn't a fraternity brother. John Street was remembered by many people as this rebel rouser, got in fights on the floor of city council, could scream and so forth and so on. I found him as mayor. He said to me, when he appointed me managing director, he said, I will never call a commissioner without going through you. I said to myself, well, that's nice. You're the mayor. You could call whoever you want. I didn't always go through commissioners. If I needed information, I went to where it was. If that was a secretary, I'd go to a secretary. But that was Street. He followed the command. He basically let me do what he thought I should be doing. He basically said, we're showing no partiality to what city gets service, whether it be snow cleanup, garbage tip. That's not the way we're going to run this administration. During the whole bug thing, I mean, it was a firestorm, and I would get calls from the press and blah 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 blah. They wanted information, and there were subpoenas and all that stuff, and you had the tapes, and it was a terrible time to be in government, a terrible time to be running. If you cared about your reputation, I wasn't happy about it. But I never saw a guy more serene. Street was a very spiritual guy. And he was, I never saw him lose his temper. Now, I knew when he was upset. If he said to me, I'm not feeling it, that meant he was upset. I never saw him yell. I'm not saying he didn't. I never saw him curse. Uh, I used to send, you know, emails to members, colleagues, a lot of funny stuff, and some of them were risque. I wouldn't do that these days. Well, I would do it these days, but I'm not a public official. Uh, and Street would learn about him. He said, well, "Why didn't you include me on those emails?" And I said, "Well, there was some foul language and stuff." So that's the guy that I saw. I saw a guy that knew more about government. I compared him. He was like a mechanic under the hood of a car. He knew more about the city's finances than anyone. He knew how, in many ways, he knew how government worked. He tried to be fair. He had a point of view. He really he, after I left, I guess it was Fairmount Park, before I became manager, he wanted me to become his press guy. Well, I wasn't going to become his press guy because by this time I'd been head of the school district. Uh, I had done that, a lot of that with Green. Uh, to me, it would have been taking a step backward. But I asked him, I said, "What's your view of the press?" I said, "I think the press has a job to do." And he says, "Sometimes we don't give them the information they need quickly enough, and we got to get better at doing that." He said, "But I'm not going to let them change my agenda." He said, "I have an agenda. That's what I'm going to do. And I'm not going to get off track so I can answer some stupid question or irrelevant question that they have." And he was geared toward the neighborhoods. And that's something I cared about. I tell people today, everything is center city, center city, center city. Center city is 7.7 square miles of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is 135 square miles. Center City is a stamp on a large envelope. 60,000 people live in Center City. The population of Philadelphia is 1.5 million. And that's where Street was going. He didn't ignore the Center City. I mean, negotiated a contract with the Philadelphia Orchestra and so on. The other thing he did that no other mayor has done, he took responsibility for the school district. Okay. He said, at that time, the city charter had been changed and the the board members were now appointed concurrently with the mayor's term. When Bill Green came in, he had Frank Rizzo's school board, and there was a huge fight, which I write about, on how to get rid of the school board so he could get his own school board in there. And Green took responsibility for the, for the school district. And so, I think he was a good mayor. Look, he would say,
Let's stay on the particular subject of the school
Yeah.
district, because we have a question from Andy Toy talking about the how about school equity? There are the charter schools and the funding inequity that come from the state and so on.
Right.
So how do you kind of look at what we are now with the
I was
question
going
of
to
equity?
say, if you want to talk about equity, thank you, Andy, for the question. Because the fact of the matter is, if you talk about equity in government, there's only one place you have to look, and that's the school district of Philadelphia. It's disgraceful, it's outrageous, it's irresponsible what goes on in with the school district of Philadelphia. I succeeded David Hornbeck because David Hornbeck basically said the truth. David Hornbeck said the funding mechanism for the school district is, I think he used the word racist. And Tom Ridge took great exception to that. Tom Ridge thought he was being called a racist. But it is racist. It's based on the property tax. Look, I now live in Haverford Township. The tax base is much higher. I remember when Amy Gutman became president of the University of Philadelphia, I said to her, I'd like to give you a tour of Philadelphia. When I say tour of Philadelphia, I always mean outside of Center City. She took me up on it. So I actually got a helicopter, and we went around the city. And as we were coming down the expressway, down the Schuylkill River, I said, look out the right side of the helicopter. That's Lower Merion. There they spend $18,000 a year educating children. Now look out the left side of the window. That's Philadelphia. There we spend $8,000 a year. Do you see a wall between Philadelphia and Lower Merion? There's no wall, but it's inequitable, um, and it's been that way for a long time. Um, it's not getting better, and what really, frankly, pisses me off at you don't hear people really talk about it. I mean, you hear school advocates, but you don't hear business people talk about it. Nothing. And the school system, I don't care what Philadelphia does, as long as it has a school system that's underfunded, with the academic rates are disgraceful, that it's a huge anchor on a city like Philadelphia. And the city of Philadelphia will never live up to its potential as long as we have that anchor.
So,
Uh, and
so
it's just more than a funding issue, Pedro.
yeah,
Uh,
talk about that.
about the
More
funding.
than being just a funding issue.
Well, okay. So one of the issues, when Green was mayor, we went through 3 school strikes. My kids were going to Philadelphia school. They would give me notes to give to the mayor to say, open up the schools. I mean, it was terrible. Uh, and then when I started as the interim CEO of the Philadelphia School District, who's on strike? The schools. They're on strike again. Now, it just was in the process of being settled. And as I walked into the building for my first day, there were pickets out. And they were all wearing red shirts, the PFT. And I'm saying to myself, I hope they don't remember that I worked for Bill Green, because Bill Green was not popular with them. 3 strikes, and he reneged on a 10% pay increase. And as I'm walking up the steps, I start to hear Bill Green, Bill Green, Bill Green. Well, they remembered who I had worked for. Uh, but one of the issues, the school district at that time, look, I'm somewhat dated, so I don't know what's going on. But what we fought for in the negotiation is what they call site selection. Teachers get are able to pick their schools by seniority. So what's that mean? It means our hardest schools, those where, I'm going to say the inner city, get the most junior teachers. They're just coming out of school because the teachers that were there transfer out, and because of their seniority. So you want to talk about systemic racism, that's part of the problem. Now, some of that's been cured, but a lot of it hasn't been cured. So can you imagine a school system that had no counselors, no guidance counselors, no nurses? I mean, that's where you have riots. That's where we should be rioting. I'm not saying you don't riot when police, kids get shot, improperly and so forth. But this city, it's so passive about it. It's just so passive about it.
So,
And
to what do you attribute the, I know the business community, the Chamber of Commerce, sometimes they make pronouncements about partnering with the schools, doing this for the schools, but I seem to agree with you in terms of that. There is not that really deep passion by the business community in Philadelphia uh, to make this a priority. Why is that?
you say there is deep passion?
There is no, there's a
No, there's
lack
no,
of deep passion. Yeah.
there's no, because I don't want to say they don't care. Look, the fact of the matter is there's 600,000 households in the city of Philadelphia. We now have, when I came to Philadelphia, there were 270,000 kids in Philadelphia schools. There were no charter schools, 270,000. There's now 120,000 kids in the public schools, another 70,000 in charter schools. Okay. So, how many households do you think in Philadelphia have any relationship with the school district? I just asked someone on the school board that question. She didn't have the answer. She said she'd get it from me. But I'm going to guess maybe 100,000. Okay, if you have, maybe 100,000, because you've got teachers who now don't have to live in the city; they can live outside the city. You have employees, so maybe 100,000. Well, 100,000 out of 600,000 is what, 12%, something like that. So only 12% really have what I'll say a real connection with the school district. Okay, and I think part of it's it's a race thing. Um, but there's, I think people have sort of given up. Look, I was involved in gun control. And why aren't more people concerned about it? I think they've sort of said, well, we're never going to change it. They may be right. And people are saying, are we going to change the school district? Uh, maybe they're right, and we can't. Um, so it's a terrible problem, and I don't know what the answer is. I mean, the answer is changing the funding system. Now, as far as charter schools, when I was there, charter schools were in existence. I do not have a problem with charter schools. I came from the private sector. Okay, well, I spent a lot of time in the public sector. I spent much more time in the private sector, and I'm all in favor of choice. And even if you didn't have people have the right to choose, and the way people have basically have chosen before charter schools was that they left the city. They moved. That's how they chose. They came over to Delaware County or Haverford, Montgomery County or wherever. And so the problem I have, and think of the school district budget is $3 billion, it's about 3.3 billion. When I was there, we were spending $80 million a year going from the school district coffers to charter schools, $80 million a year. You know what it is now? 1.1 million. Almost one out of every $3 is being taken from Wawa and given to 7-Eleven, from Macy's to Gimbel's. Now, I think the real issue is keep charter schools, make sure that they're regulated properly, make sure they're up and people aren't lining their own pockets, but then have a separate funding stream from the state to charter school, as opposed to saying it should come from the Philadelphia School District. Yeah, the school district should be reducing its expenses because it doesn't need as many buildings and so forth, and that gets involved in controversy. So, I'm in favor of charter schools. I'm not in favor of the funding mechanism. I'm not in favor of the oversight thing. Cyber schools are a total disgrace, a total ripoff. And I don't know whose pockets are being lined, but someone's pockets are being lined that these things have the support that they have. And what's happening in charter schools, it's gone from Philadelphia to school districts around the state now. And now school districts around the state are starting to feel the same financial pinch that Philadelphia is. So I think in time, there will be more pressure in Harrisburg to do something about it.
So, Phil, as you look back,
I just want to make sure that everyone understands what I'm saying, that I'm not being too vague or not being firm enough in my answers.
No, I think that this particular resonates with some of the people in the audience. Phil, in terms of looking at the city as a whole now and the challenges that lies ahead, we're emerging out of the pandemic that in some way has created some setbacks to some progress to be made in the question of equity. What would be the one advice you would give both to each of the following? The administration of the city on how to move the equity piece in the middle of this crisis that we live in.
Well, I would say two things. One, don't become mayor and don't become managing director. I couldn't think of a worse time to be mayor of a city, or a worse time of becoming managing director or so forth. I mean, with the police issues, with the COVID-19 and so forth. I mean, it's just a terrible time. So I don't have any, I don't know the answer. I mean, my concern is that, the progress that Philadelphia has made in certain neighborhoods of Philadelphia is going to go backwards. And I think we're going to be looking more like Philadelphia of the 1980s than we are the Philadelphia of 2000. Population is going to drop. Population has been dropping for, I think in 2010 was the first time it went up in probably 50 years, like 0.3%. So it's been going up a little bit. I don't see that happening. I mean, I tell you, I speak to realtors. They say people are leaving. People don't want to be in buildings with elevators. and so forth. I mean, we know. So I don't have an answer. I think it's going to require a lot of someone with a lot of guts to really right size government, and there's going to have to be something done on the tax things. I think an equity issue is, and I've written, I was a columnist after I left the city on tax abatements and tax exempt properties. Those are equity issues. They're not financial issues. When tax abatements are there for a reason. When they first came in place, I think it was 1980 or 1970, it was supposed to be a 3-year program to get the city moving again. I went and I actually read the city council testimony. It's going to be a 3-year program. That was 1980. We're now into the 40th year of it, right? 40th year of it. And it's, there's been some, there's no reason in the world that the school district should be included in the tax abatement program. That is really saying that school children are underwriting the cost of labor unions and developers. The reason that the prices are high in Philadelphia are because the unions' prices are high. And I'm talking about unions, and I can't imagine, unions that don't hire enough minorities. Minorities been shut out of the action. And those are the unions that city council members get behind, they're scared of. And that's and allows them to have elevated rates in Philadelphia. And that because of elevated rates, developers are saying we're not going to develop in Philadelphia unless we get tax abatements. Well, those tax abatements should not come from the school district. Okay. As far as pilots go, we are so behind other cities in pilots. It's disgraceful. This has really been a hot topic for me, but I'm too old for this stuff now. At one point in time, Philadelphia was getting $300,000. This is just a few $300,000 in payment in lieu of taxes, and it was both basically coming from a nursing home up in the Roxborough area. I forget the name of it. Cathedral Village. They were paying the bulk of it. Penn, nothing. Temple, nothing. CHOP, nothing. Penn Hospital, nothing. Einstein, nothing. The University of Boston University in its by itself, I'm going back 10 years, was giving $4 million a year to the city of Boston and pilots. And we did nothing. Rendell tried to do it as mayor, and then they picked and so what's happened is Rendell becomes an instructor at Penn. David Cohn becomes chairman of the board. Greg Ross is chief of staff. Okay, he was Rendell. So all these people. Kenny taught a course at Penn, and everyone says, "Oh, pilots, and they do such great work for the city and so forth." No, universities and certainly hospitals are no longer nonprofit institutions. Where they say if it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck and speaks like it's a duck. These things they're engaged in mergers and so forth and so on, and they should be giving money. Now, people say, well, Penn just gave back $100 million. That's $10 million a year. That's nice. But $10 million a year ain't a lot of money for a university like Penn. And what I think should be done is I'd like someone from city council to have the balls to really take this on and say, look, Penn, you use Pell Grants as a measure. Pell Grants are given to poor kids. And there's a ranking of what percent of universities' money goes to Pell Grants. Well, Penn's like 35th or 38th on the list. And if you want tax abatements or be tax exempt, you got to do more in admitting Philadelphia kids to your universities, whether it be St. Joe's, LaSalle, Temple, Penn. Philadelphia kids that qualify, and they do qualify. But Pell Grant eligible kids, tied into something like that, tie the hospitals into provide nurses or free eye exams or whatever to the school district. And so you just need someone to get on there and embarrass them. That's what I think.
So, and
I hope I made myself clear.
That is very clear and very forceful.
Thank you.
Thank you. We get into the end of our program today, and just what advice would you give to some of us who like to, people don't have much time to, and if they want to get one or two issues that they should be really immersed in to try to change the whole situation with equity or to make life better in Philadelphia, what would that be based on your experience?
Uh, well, I think I think the pilot program, something like that. I think that, it, the hospitals and so forth. I mean, it's somewhat of a bad time, but it's never a good time. I think there's could be more people speaking out about that, and I think getting more involved in trying to change the funding and some of the practices at the school district. But and then we have the issue of the police. I mean, I don't understand why police pull their gun out and shoot someone in the back or in the heart when they can shoot them in the leg if the fact they have to shoot. And I don't know where the mayor is on this. I don't know. I don't mean to be critical of Kenny, but one thing we need in this day and age, and someone said it the other day, and I agree, was, and my view of Rendell as mayor is probably different than some people on this phone call's view, but he was a great cheerleader. This is a time the city of Philadelphia needs a cheerleader to talk about. We're going to come back. We're going to get these restaurants back again. We're going to fix this. I don't hear that coming from the mayor. I really don't. And so we need people to come out and sort of cheerlead a little bit. But I think one of the great things that's come back, and you all should read Stamp from the Beginning, or the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, and you'll see about the racism and the systemic racism, which frankly I never realized. I mean, I've become more sensitive in time as I worked for black mayors and I worked at a school district, and so forth. But it's so much out there, and it's so much in. I talk about civil service. I'm talking off the top of my head, and maybe Linda Orfanelli will tell me different. But we should be looking at it from a racial point of view. It was a good government point of view in the beginning. Uh, and we should be looking at, are there impediments there that really are no longer valid in this day and age, as we become more sensitive to the issue of race.
Well,
Uh,
well, Phil, thank you so much for this conversation today.
let me just promote my book. I would not be good. And
Absolutely.
if anyone, I will send you a book. They're hard to get from Amazon right now because Amazon's busy dealing with different issues like shipping vaccines and stuff like that. But if you send me an email, it's pgold4110 @gmail.com. I have about 15 copies. I'll send it, and you'll pay me when you get the book, and I'll sign it for you if you want it signed. But there's a lot of good stories in there, and I've only, scratched the surface. But
We
thanks for
recommend.
having me.
Yes, we recommend that you get the book. We put the link to the site on Amazon, but I'm going to put your email address here on the
Yes,
chat so people can connect with you directly.
thank you.
Thanks so much
Thank
for
you.
invitation.
Thank